On a warm September evening in 1994, the fading light draped the small rural town of Ashford in a soft, honeyed glow, the kind of light that made the air feel still and safe. 16-year-old Emily Carter stepped out of her best friend's modest, white-clapboard house just after sunset, her laughter still lingering in the air from their shared stories and whispered secrets. The walk home was only a few streets over, a well-worn route that passed quiet porches, leaning picket fences, and the steady hum of cicadas hidden in the trees. She carried her worn canvas backpack over one shoulder, the zipper half open, revealing the corner of a spiral notebook and a paperback novel she had been reading. Somewhere along the way, under the amber glow of the street lamps, Emily vanished. The next morning, her backpack was found slumped against the base of a telephone pole on Harrow Street, its contents spilled in a careless scatter of papers and a single pen lying in the gutter. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading into the woods, no torn fabric to hint at a chase. Word of her disappearance spread quickly. The news carried on the voices of worried neighbors and the static of the local radio. That night, men and women fanned out into the surrounding fields with flashlights, calling Emily's name into the darkness until their voices cracked. Some combed the old railway tracks. Others swept through the abandoned barns at the edge of town. Despite their efforts, nothing surfaced. Standing at the center of the search, wearing her husband's old denim jacket and gripping a flashlight until her knuckles whitened, Grace Carter's face was a mask of fear and determination. She had raised her daughter to be cautious, to come straight home, to never linger in the dark alone. She knew in her bones that Emily had not run away, yet when she pressed her fears to the local authorities, the response was cool and unyielding. Police Chief Daniel Crowe, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel and decades in the force, addressed the gathered volunteers in the fire station hall, assuring them there was no evidence of foul play. He called Emily a runaway, a troubled girl who had likely left of her own accord. Grace stared at him in disbelief, her pulse roaring in her ears. Emily had been excited about her school's fall festival, had been planning to bake cookies for the church fundraiser that weekend. There had been no signs of discontent, no hints of escape. The words runaway hung in the air like an accusation, but Grace would not let them take root. That night, as the search tapered off and the town settled into an uneasy silence, Grace sat at the kitchen table under the dim yellow light, Emily's favorite mug still half full of cold tea. Outside, the street was empty, the wind carrying the faint rattle of dried leaves along the pavement. Somewhere in that stillness, Grace made herself a promise. She would not rest until she knew where her daughter was, no matter how many doors she had to knock on, no matter how many years it took. By the summer of 1996, the once urgent search for Emily Carter had slowed to a near standstill, the relentless energy of those first weeks giving way to an uncomfortable acceptance among many in the small town of Ashford. The posters with her smiling face, once bright and crisp, had curled at the edges and faded under the sun, yet Grace Carter refused to let them vanish entirely. She made it her mission to keep Emily's image alive, replacing worn photographs in shop windows, post offices, and the corkboard at the town library. Every week she carried a stack of freshly printed flyers in her tote bag, slipping them under doors, pinning them to community boards, and leaving them on cafe counters. Her persistence was met with polite nods from neighbors, but she could sense the way some averted their eyes, weary of a mystery that refused to resolve. The police files, now labeled cold case, gathered dust in the evidence room, the photographs and statements sealed away like artifacts from a story no one wanted to reopen. Grace, however, never stopped pressing for updates. Her calls to the station met with the same rehearsed responses that there were no new leads, no new evidence, nothing further to report. It was during one of these visits to the station, in the dimly lit hallway, lined with plaques of commendations and long retired officers, that she encountered Mark Holden. He had been on the force during the early days of the search, a man with a quiet presence and a cautious way of speaking. He greeted her with a small nod, his eyes holding something she couldn't quite read. When she pressed him, asking if he truly believed Emily had run away, his gaze dropped to the worn carpet, and he hesitated. In a voice so low she had to lean forward to catch it. He admitted that something about the original investigation had never sat right with him. There had been details, he said, that did not line up, but when she urged him to explain, his expression hardened, and he shook his head. It was not his place, he murmured, and he walked away, leaving Grace standing there with more questions than before. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, thinking about the weight in Holden's voice. She wondered what truths had been buried alongside her daughter's case file, and who had decided they should stay there. Outside, the streets of Ashford lay quiet, the same quiet that had swallowed Emily's last footsteps 2 years earlier. Grace knew that for some, the case would remain an unsolved chapter, tucked away and forgotten, but for her, it was an open wound that refused to heal. She traced the edge of Emily's photograph with her fingertips, vowing once again that she would not let her daughter's face fade into the background of the town's history, no matter how many doors remained closed to her. By the autumn of 1997, the air in Ashford carried more than the usual chill of approaching winter. Beneath the quiet routines of small-town life, there was a current of unease, a low murmur that slipped between conversations in the diner, the grocery store, and the pews of the church. Whispers had begun to weave their way through the community about Police Chief Daniel Crowe and the way he had handled the search for Emily Carter. Some recalled with guarded voices that a few townsfolk had come forward in those first frantic days, claiming to have seen Emily on the night she vanished, standing near the curb under the glow of a street lamp, speaking to a uniformed officer. The memory was hazy for some and crystal clear for others, but what lingered was not just the image of the encounter. It was the way those witness statements seemed to vanish as quickly as they had been made. People who had spoken to the police said they were never called back. Their accounts never followed up. A few swore that when they asked about their original statements, they were told no such reports existed. Still, the words were always spoken in hushed tones, because Crowe was not just the chief, he was a fixture in Ashford, a man with decades of service and an image polished by years of parades, charity events, and commendations pinned to his chest. There were those who defended him fiercely, dismissing the whispers as the byproduct of grief and suspicion, the kind of talk that grew in the empty spaces left by unanswered questions. But Grace Carter heard the rumors too, each one settling in her mind like a shard of glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. She could not forget how quickly Crowe had labeled Emily a runaway, how he had seemed more eager to close the file than to follow the faintest of leads. When she asked about the supposed sightings, she was met with a polite but firm denial, the kind that ended conversations before they could begin. In her heart, Grace felt the weight of something hidden, a truth that lived just beyond her reach, guarded by walls of authority and silence. On evenings when the house felt too empty and the clocks ticking too loud, she would imagine Emily's last moments, wondering if her daughter's final conversation had been with the very man sworn to protect her. The image gnawed at her, and though she tried to push it aside, the whispers in town made it impossible to forget. Still, without proof, the rumors drifted like smoke, never catching fire, never becoming anything more than speculation. And so, Daniel Crowe's reputation remained unbroken, his polished badge gleaming under the same lights that for others cast only shadows. Yet, in Grace's mind, those shadows were lengthening, stretching across the years, waiting for the day when the truth would no longer be something that could be quietly filed away and forgotten. In the spring of 2021, the quiet outskirts of Ashford stirred with the sound of heavy machinery, and the low hum of construction crews as a property developer began clearing acres of long-neglected farmland to make way for a new industrial site. The land had been left untouched for decades, its fields overgrown with tall grass, and its boundaries marked by sagging fences that leaned like tired sentinels. At the far edge of the property stood the skeletal remains of an old grain mill, its windows shattered, its roof bowed in places where the weather had worn it thin. The mill had been abandoned since the late 1990s, left to the elements and the slow reclaiming grip of nature. It was during the survey of the mill's perimeter that a worker stumbled across something unexpected tucked behind a collapsed shed. There, half hidden by brambles and rusted machinery parts, was a towering grain silo, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and moss. A thick chain looped around the narrow access door, secured by a padlock that was dull with age, yet still firmly in place. The discovery stirred immediate curiosity among the crew, who speculated about its contents, joking about forgotten harvests or relics from the mill's operational days. But something about the silo's placement felt deliberate, almost as if it had been tucked away to be forgotten. The site manager, thinking it might be unsafe or contain hazardous materials, contacted local authorities to arrange an inspection before proceeding. When the deputy arrived and examined the lock, he noted its age, but also its surprising durability, as though someone had taken care to preserve it despite the years. He ordered the padlock cut. As the metal gave way with a groan, the door creaked open on reluctant hinges, releasing a stale, heavy air that carried the faint scent of dust, oil, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. Inside, the weak light from the doorway spilled across stacks of decayed wooden crates and the remnants of old feed bags, their fabric crumbling at the edges. But as the beam from the deputy's flashlight swept the interior, it revealed something that made the crew fall silent. Against the curved wall of the silo lay a bundle of faded fabric, the colors muted but still recognizable as a patterned dress. The cut and size matched a style that had been common in the mid-1990s, and in that moment, for those who had lived in Ashford long enough, a chilling thought began to take shape. The deputy stepped closer, his boots crunching on the grit-strewn floor, and saw that the dress was folded neatly, almost reverently, and beside it sat a small plastic hair clip, dulled with time. What began as a routine inspection had taken a sharp turn into something far darker, and though no one spoke it aloud just yet, they all knew this discovery might awaken a story the town had tried, for nearly 3 decades, to forget. The morning after the grain silo was discovered, the area was sealed off with bright yellow tape, the quiet fields now buzzing with the presence of law enforcement vehicles and the low murmur of investigators at work. The air was damp from an overnight rain, and the ground squelched under boots as a forensic team approached the rusted door. Grace Carter, hearing whispers from a neighbor who worked with the property developer, had driven out to the site, though she was kept at a distance beyond the cordon. From where she stood, she could see the beam of flashlights cutting through the dim interior, their light catching on floating dust motes and illuminating the shapes within. Inside, the investigators moved carefully among the shadows, cataloging the contents with methodical precision. Decayed wooden crates lay slumped in uneven stacks, their corners softened with rot, spilling fragments of burlap sacks and long-forgotten feed. In one corner, a small pile of discarded uniforms lay heaped together, the dark blue fabric mottled with mildew, their brass buttons dulled to a muted bronze. One of the officers lifted a shirt and examined its faded insignia, exchanging a glance with his partner before setting it gently aside. But it was the discovery near the center of the silo that stilled the room into an unnatural silence. There, half hidden beneath a frayed tarp, was a bundle of fabric folded into a careful square. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had seen Emily Carter's missing person posters in 1994, a faded floral print with tiny blue blossoms scattered over cream cotton. The dress had been washed of its vibrancy by time, but its shape, its size, the stitching at the hem, all matched the one she had been wearing the night she walked away from her friend's house and never returned. Grace could not see it from where she stood, but she felt its presence in her chest, a deep, unspoken recognition that made her breath hitch. An investigator, following a hunch, began tapping his boot against the floor near where the dress had been found. The hollow echo that answered was out of place against the solid metal of the silo's base. They pried at the boards, revealing a false floor cleverly fitted to blend with the rest of the structure. Beneath it lay the dark, cramped cavity that would yield the most chilling find of all. Skeletal remains, curled inward as if in final retreat, rested on a bed of disturbed earth. Beside them, coated in a film of rust and dirt, was a police badge. Its lettering was still faintly visible, the emblem tarnished but intact. The room seemed to grow colder as the badge was lifted into the light, and an unspoken weight settled over the investigators. Outside, Grace caught the change in their movements, the sudden gravity in their expressions as they emerged. Though no one had yet said the words, she knew in her soul that whatever had been uncovered in that silo was tied to the truth she had been chasing for 27 years. The forensic report arrived 3 weeks after the discovery in the silo, its pages heavy with the weight of a truth Grace Carter had dreaded for 27 long years. The bones, fragile and incomplete, had been carefully examined, each fragment photographed, measured, and tested. When the results came back, there was no room for doubt. The DNA matched the samples taken from Emily's hairbrush in 1994, the same one Grace had kept tucked in her dresser drawer all these years, never able to bring herself to throw it away. The confirmation sent a ripple through Ashford, a town that had long learned to live alongside the unanswered question of Emily's fate. What followed next only deepened the shock. The rusted police badge found beside the remains had been cleaned and restored just enough for the engraved number to become legible. Records pulled from the old department roster matched the badge to none other than Daniel Crowe, the man who had led the original investigation, the man who had stood before the community and insisted Emily had simply run away. The revelation struck like a lightning bolt through the fragile fabric of trust that held the town together. In diners and grocery aisles, voices dropped to whispers as people tried to reconcile the image they had of the former chief, a man lauded for his decades of service, with the grim evidence now tied to his name. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the idea that there must be some mistake, that the badge could have been planted. Others, recalling the strange inconsistencies and the rumors that had floated beneath the surface for years, admitted to themselves they were not entirely surprised. Grace felt the news like a stone in her chest. She thought back to those early days, to his dismissive tone, to the way he had shut down leads and brushed aside witnesses who had claimed to see Emily speaking to a uniformed officer. The memory took on a new and sinister shape now, one that made her skin crawl. Yet even with the evidence in hand, there was no confession, no explanation. Crowe had been retired for years, living quietly in a small house outside of town, his once commanding frame stooped with age. The sheriff's office announced that the investigation would be reopened, but cautioned that it could take months, even years, to fully unravel the truth. Grace stood on her porch that evening, watching the last light sink behind the hills, her mind heavy with the knowledge that the man she had once pleaded with for help might have been the one who had taken her daughter's life. In the stillness, the town seemed different, as though every street and storefront now held a hidden shadow. For the first time, the unspoken fear that someone in power had betrayed them was no longer just a whisper. It was a truth written plainly in the cold language of evidence. Grace Carter had spent 27 years carrying the weight of her daughter's absence, like a stone in her chest, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment she was called to the county coroner's office to identify the recovered items. The sterile room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting an unforgiving brightness on the table where the evidence lay. When the investigator gently lifted the protective covering, Grace's breath caught as her eyes fell on the faded floral dress, the one Emily had worn on that September night in 1994. The fabric, once soft and vibrant, was now dulled with age, its tiny blue blossoms barely visible, yet it was unmistakably her daughter's. For a moment, the room tilted, and Grace gripped the edge of the table, feeling the years collapse in on her. She saw Emily in the kitchen again, twirling in that dress, asking if it looked nice, her laughter as light as the breeze through the open window. The memory burned against the sight before her now, and tears welled unbidden, spilling down her cheeks. The investigator spoke softly, explaining that the dress had been found folded beside skeletal remains confirmed to be Emily's, along with a rusted police badge belonging to former Chief Daniel Crowe. Grace's hands trembled, but her voice, when it came, was steady, sharpened by a fury that had been simmering for decades. She told them she wanted the case reopened immediately, no matter how deep into the police department's history they had to dig, no matter whose name came up. She could not, would not, allow Emily's death to remain a closed file. As the investigator nodded, noting her request, Grace felt the familiar ache of grief twist into something harder, something that felt like purpose. For years, she had fought to keep her daughter's name alive in a town that had grown weary of the story, a town that had been far too willing to accept the word runaway. Now she had proof that those years of doubt, the quiet suspicions that had haunted her, were not misplaced. She walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air, the sound of traffic muted by the rush of her own thoughts. If corruption had protected Daniel Crowe all these years, then the truth would be dragged into the light, no matter how much it shook Ashford's foundation. Standing by her car, she closed her eyes and pictured Emily's smile, the way her daughter's hair had fallen into her eyes when she laughed. Grace whispered a promise into the wind, a vow that this fight would be the last thing she ever did if that was what it took. The time for whispers and polite requests had ended. Now there was only the truth, and she would not rest until every last piece of it was brought into the open. When news of the discovery in the silo spread beyond Ashford, it stirred memories long buried in people who had once lived in or passed through the town. One of those people was Jenna Rawlings, a woman in her early 40s now living 2 counties away, who had never forgotten a night in the summer of 1995 when she was 17 years old. She came forward quietly at first, calling the sheriff's office to ask if anyone had considered other cases connected to the name Daniel Crowe. When investigators invited her in, she sat at the small interview table, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, and told them something she had kept to herself for more than 2 decades. Back then, she had been walking home from her part-time job at a diner when a patrol car pulled up alongside her. The officer inside, wearing a crisp uniform and speaking in a calm, authoritative voice, told her there had been reports of trouble in the area and offered her a ride to keep her safe. She hesitated, explaining that her house was only a few blocks away, but he pressed her, insisting it was no trouble and that her parents would be relieved. Something in his tone, polite yet oddly insistent, made her uneasy. When she refused again and began to walk faster, the patrol car crept along beside her until she ducked into a side street and hid behind a hedge until she heard the sound of the engine fade. Shaken, she told her parents what happened, and they urged her to report it. But when she did, the officer at the desk dismissed her as being overly nervous and suggested she must have misunderstood, calling her reaction hysterical. No follow-up was ever done, and the incident faded into the background of her life, a shadow she never entirely forgot. Now, with Crowe's name linked to Emily Carter's murder, Jenna's unease hardened into certainty. She told the investigators that when she saw his photograph in the news, older now but still carrying the same sharp eyes and square jaw, she recognized him as the man behind the wheel that night. The room fell quiet as her words sank in, For the first time in years, Jenna felt the weight of that memory lighten just slightly, knowing someone was finally listening. She left the station with her statement on record, her mind still replaying the sound of the gravel crunching under the patrol car's tires as it had followed her in 1995. In her heart, she believed she had escaped the fate that had taken Emily and perhaps others, and that truth filled her with a complicated mix of gratitude and guilt. For investigators, her account added another fracture in the image of Daniel Crowe, another thread connecting him to the web of fear and silence that had blanketed Ashford for far too long. Mark Holden had carried the memory like a stone in his pocket since that September night in 1994, its edges pressing into him whenever he thought of Emily Carter's disappearance. In the years since, he had retired from the Ashford Police Department, moved to a smaller home on the edge of town, and told himself that staying silent had been the safest choice. But when the news broke about the discovery in the silo and Daniel Crowe's name began to circulate in connection to the case, the weight of his secret grew unbearable. Grace Carter was the one person he had always avoided, knowing that to face her would be to face his own failure. Yet one grey afternoon, he called her and asked if she would meet him at the small cafe on Main Street. She arrived wearing a heavy coat, her eyes wary but curious, and they sat in a booth by the window, where the weak winter light slanted across the table. Mark's hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around his coffee mug, the steam curling between them like a veil. He told her that on the night Emily vanished, he had been driving back from a routine patrol when he passed the old grain mill on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for years even then, its hulking silhouette a familiar landmark against the fields. What caught his attention was the sight of Crowe's patrol car parked just beyond the mill, partially concealed by the shadow of the silo. It was late, long after the time Crowe should have been home, and there had been no call or report that explained his presence there. Mark admitted he slowed his own vehicle, considering whether to stop, but something in him hesitated. Crowe had a way of making his authority felt, and at that time he commanded the department with an iron grip. Speaking against him felt like stepping into a storm without cover. So Mark drove on, telling himself it was nothing, that maybe Crowe was checking on trespassers or following up on some lead. But in the days that followed, when Emily's disappearance consumed the town and Crowe seemed strangely dismissive of possible sightings, Mark began to suspect the truth was darker. Fear kept him silent. Fear for his career, for his safety, for the subtle but ruinous ways Crowe could dismantle a man's life. Now, decades later, he could no longer justify the silence. Grace listened without interrupting, her face pale but composed, the only sign of emotion in the tight grip she kept on her mug. When he finished, she nodded slowly, her voice low but steady, as she told him that what he had just shared might be the piece that finally broke the case open. For the first time in years, Mark felt a flicker of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that his truth had come far too late to save Emily. As the investigation into Daniel Crowe's possible involvement in Emily Carter's disappearance gained momentum, the attention of the press turned toward his past, unearthing details that Ashford had either never known or had quietly chosen to forget. Local reporters, joined by journalists from nearby cities, began combing through old personnel files, archived meeting minutes, and faded newspaper clippings from the late 1980s. What they found painted a troubling picture beneath the polished image Crowe had maintained for decades. Buried in the records were several internal complaints filed during his time as a lieutenant, each one alleging inappropriate behavior toward young women, some of them barely out of high school. The complaints, written in careful, restrained language, described encounters that blurred the boundaries of his authority, ranging from suggestive remarks to more unsettling propositions. In each case, the files showed the same outcome. The matter was reviewed internally, noted as unsubstantiated, and quietly closed without further action. When reporters sought out the women who had come forward back then, They discovered that 2 of them had left Ashford within a year of filing their complaints, their departures abrupt and unexplained. Neighbors from that time recalled hurried moving vans, blinds drawn tight, and phone lines suddenly disconnected. One former classmate of one of the women told a journalist she remembered how the girl had stopped coming to church, stopped answering letters, as though she had erased her connection to the town entirely. For Grace Carter, reading these reports in the morning paper was like watching the pieces of a long-hidden puzzle begin to fall into place. She thought back to those early days after Emily vanished, to the way Crow had seemed to control not just the investigation, but the entire narrative surrounding it. She wondered now how many others had been silenced, how many stories had been buried under official stamps and closed files. The town, too, began to shift uneasily under the weight of these revelations. Some residents, fiercely loyal to Crow's years of service, dismissed the findings as irrelevant or malicious, a dredging up of old grievances meant to tarnish a man's legacy. Others, especially those who had harbored quiet suspicions for years, felt a grim vindication. In the corner booth of the diner, old friends exchanged knowing looks. In the aisles of the grocery store, conversations lowered to whispers when his name was mentioned. The more the reporters dug, the more the image of Crow as a steadfast public servant eroded, replaced by something darker, something that had lived in the shadows for decades. Grace clipped every article, tucking them into a folder already thick with notes and photographs, each page another reminder that the truth about what happened to her daughter was tangled in a history of power, intimidation, and silence. And now, at last, those silences were beginning to break. The town hall was packed that night, the low murmur of voices echoing off the paneled walls as residents filled every seat and stood shoulder to shoulder along the back. Grace Carter sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the weight of 27 years pressing down on her as she waited for the meeting to begin. Daniel Crow, now 73 and walking with a slight stoop, entered with a calm expression that seemed rehearsed, nodding to familiar faces as though he was still the respected chief of Ashford, and not the man whose name had become tangled in whispers and headlines. The mayor's introduction was brief, and soon the floor was opened to questions. At first, the inquiries were polite but pointed, touching on his past leadership and the state of the department during his tenure. Then, voices grew sharper, residents demanding explanations for the badge found beside Emily Carter's remains in the silo, pressing him about the internal complaints from the late 1980s. Crow's answers came quickly, each one delivered with an air of practiced dismissal. He claimed the badge must have been stolen or planted, that the complaints were false, the product of personal grudges. Grace listened, her heart pounding in her ears, until she could no longer stay silent. She rose from her seat, her voice steady but carrying through the hall as she reminded everyone of the night in 1994 when her daughter vanished, of the years of unanswered questions, of the discovery in the abandoned mill. When she spoke of the silo, her eyes locked on Crow's, and for the briefest moment, something shifted in his expression. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Grace saw it, the flicker of recognition, the tightening around his eyes before he smoothed his features back into calm neutrality. She pressed on, asking him directly if he had been there the night Emily disappeared, if he had parked his patrol car by that mill as a witness had claimed. He denied it with the same speed as before, but his voice caught just slightly, enough for the room to feel the change. A murmur spread among the crowd, the tension thickening as people glanced at one another. Crow's composure seemed to strain under the weight of so many eyes, his hands gripping the lectern a little too tightly. The mayor attempted to move the meeting forward, but the shift in the air was undeniable. Grace sat back down, her pulse still racing, her mind turning over the look she had seen in his eyes. It was not fear, exactly, but the guarded reflex of someone who knew more than they would ever admit aloud. As the meeting wound to a close and people began to file out into the cool night, Grace knew that while she had not gotten an admission, she had seen something that told her she was right to keep pushing. Crow's mask had cracked, if only for a moment, and she would not let that moment be forgotten. The arrest came on a grey morning in late October of 2021, when the clouds hung low over the fields surrounding Ashford, and the air carried the bite of approaching winter. At 7 o'clock, a convoy of unmarked state police vehicles rolled quietly down the narrow road leading to Daniel Crow's modest home just beyond the town limits. The once commanding figure of Ashford's police department had been living there in quiet retirement, his days marked by solitary walks to the mailbox and the occasional trip into town. Neighbors later said they had noticed an unusual stillness that morning, the kind that precedes a storm. When the officers approached, Crow opened the door, dressed in a worn flannel shirt and dark slacks, his hair silvered and unkempt, his expression calm but wary. They read him his rights as they stepped inside, explaining the charges and the evidence gathered against him, witness statements placing his patrol car near the mill on the night Emily Carter vanished in 1994, the recovered badge buried beside her remains, and forensic links connecting materials from the silo to items once stored in the police evidence room under his authority. Crow listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly, but offered no words in his defense. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have in the small, tidy living room. Outside, a few neighbors had gathered at the end of the drive, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and grim recognition. For decades, Crow's name had been synonymous with law and order in Ashford, his presence in parades and at community events a constant reminder of his influence. Now, the sight of him being led down the steps in handcuffs shattered that image in an instant. News traveled fast. Within an hour, photographs of the arrest were circulating on local news sites and social media. The image of the former chief, head bowed slightly, flanked by state police, becoming a symbol of betrayal that cut deep in a town already burdened by unanswered questions. Grace Carter received the call from an investigator while she was standing in her kitchen, the morning paper unopened on the table. Hearing the words, "We have him," sent a tremor through her, a surge of vindication mixed with the sobering knowledge that this was only the beginning. The arrest was not the end of the fight, but it was a step toward the justice she had promised her daughter. Across town, in diners and grocery store aisles, conversations buzzed with disbelief. Some clung to the idea of Crow's innocence, unwilling to let go of the man they thought they knew. Others, recalling old suspicions, felt a grim satisfaction. But no one could deny the image now fixed in the public eye. A man who had once worn the badge with authority, now wearing the weight of his own guilt in steel around his wrists. In the stark, windowless interrogation room at the state police headquarters, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights filled the silence between questions. Daniel Crow sat with his hands clasped loosely on the table, his posture straight, his face composed in the way of a man who had spent decades commanding a room. At first, his denials were unwavering. He did not know how his badge ended up beside Emily Carter's remains. He had never been near the silo. He had nothing to do with her disappearance in 1994. The detectives listened without interruption, letting his words fill the space until they slid a folder across the table and opened it to reveal photographs. One by one, they placed them before him. The first was the faded floral dress, the same one Emily had worn that September night. Then came the image of the rusted badge, its engraving still legible. Finally, they showed him a wide shot of the interior of the silo, with the false floor lifted and the skeletal remains visible in the dim light. For a long moment, Crow stared at the photographs, his jaw tightening, the mask of authority he had worn so carefully beginning to crack. He shifted in his chair, leaning back as though the extra inches might put distance between himself and what lay on the table. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. He admitted that he had stopped Emily on her walk home, that he had pulled up in his patrol car and offered her a ride. When she refused, he followed her for a short while, eventually pulling ahead and stepping out to block her path. His words came haltingly, each one measured, as he claimed he had just meant to scare her, to remind her of the dangers of walking alone at night. He offered no explanation for how that encounter had ended with her death, only vague references to a situation that got out of control. The detectives pressed him, but he would not go further, his eyes fixed on the table, as if avoiding their gaze could shield him from the weight of his admission. Outside the interrogation room, news of his partial confession spread quickly through the station, and within hours, it reached the public. Outrage erupted across Ashford and beyond. For many, the idea that the man sworn to protect their children had admitted to targeting one of them, however he tried to soften it, was unforgivable. Grace Carter, informed of the confession by the lead investigator, felt a storm of emotions rise within her. There was anger, deep and consuming, but also a hollow ache at the thought of Emily's final moments. Crow's words had not given her the truth she longed for, only a confirmation of the betrayal she had suspected all these years. In the eyes of the community, his reputation was no longer tarnished. It was shattered beyond repair. The trial of Daniel Crow began in the spring of 2022, drawing reporters, former colleagues, and townspeople who had lived under his shadow for decades. The courthouse in the county seat was packed from the first day, the air thick with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case, painting a damning portrait of a man who had used his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a shield for predatory behavior. They detailed the events of September in 1994, weaving in witness accounts, forensic evidence from the silo, and the testimony of those who had come forward with long-buried encounters, each one chipping away at the image Crow had cultivated over the years. They spoke of patterns of intimidation, the quiet closing of internal complaints in the late 1980s, and the calculated manipulation of investigations that might have exposed him sooner. Grace Carter took the stand on the third day. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm but resolute. Her voice was steady, even as she recounted the night Emily vanished, the endless search that followed, and the years of being told her daughter had simply run away. She spoke of the day she saw the dress again, faded but unmistakable, and of the moment she learned the badge beside it had belonged to the man she had once begged for help. As she described the toll the years had taken, the birthdays missed, the empty seat at family gatherings, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft scratching of pens on notepads. Crow, seated at the defense table, avoided her eyes, his once proud shoulders hunched slightly forward. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting the evidence was circumstantial, that the badge could have been planted, that memory, after so many years, was unreliable. But the prosecution's narrative was relentless, each piece of testimony fitting into a larger pattern of abuse and concealment. When the jury left to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Hours later, they returned, their faces solemn, and the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. Guilty on all counts: murder, abduction, and misconduct in office. A collective exhale seemed to move through the room. Grace closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in something quieter, a bittersweet release after 27 years of carrying a weight no parent should bear. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones, but she moved past them without stopping, the cool air filling her lungs. The justice handed down that day could never return what she had lost, but it was a reckoning long overdue, and in that moment, she felt that Emily's voice had finally been heard. The morning sun was soft and golden when Grace Carter walked through the gates of Ashford Cemetery, the cool air carrying the faint scent of dew and fresh-cut grass. It had been only a few weeks since Daniel Crowe was sentenced, but the world already felt different to her, as though a shadow that had hung over the town since 1994 had finally lifted, even if only slightly. She carried a bouquet of pale lilies in one hand and a small tarnished police whistle in the other, the kind that once hung from a chain on every officer's uniform. The path to Emily's grave was familiar, worn into her memory from years of visits filled with unanswered questions. Now the headstone stood restored, its once weathered surface polished, the lettering crisp and clear. Kneeling, Grace laid the flowers gently at its base, her fingers lingering on the cool stone as she traced her daughter's name. Then, with deliberate care, she placed the whistle on top, the metal glinting in the light. It was not meant as a tribute to the institution that had failed her, but as a symbol that the truth had finally been sounded, that Emily's story had broken through decades of silence. For a long time she stayed there, speaking softly as though her daughter could hear, telling her about the verdict, about the people who had come forward, and about the new work she was beginning. In the weeks after the trial, Grace had founded the Emily Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the labyrinth of law enforcement, media, and public scrutiny. It was her way of ensuring that no one else would be left to fight alone, that predators who hid behind badges, titles, or any position of power would be brought into the light. The Foundation's first outreach had already begun, offering resources and legal aid to families across the state. Support poured in from those who had followed the case, moved by the persistence and courage Grace had shown. Standing at the grave, she felt both the ache of loss and the quiet strength of purpose, the two now intertwined in a way that would define the rest of her life. She knew the grief would never leave her. It had carved itself too deeply. But she also knew that Emily's name would no longer be spoken only in sorrow. It would be a warning, a rallying cry, a reminder that justice, though slow and painful, was possible. As the morning breeze stirred the flowers, Grace rose, brushing the grass from her knees. She looked out over the rows of headstones, each one a story, and then back to Emily's, her heart steady. The fight that had begun with a missing girl in 1994 was not over, but it had changed shape. Now, it was a promise to protect others, to make sure no voice was silenced and no truth was buried again.